Hey guys, so today I will be going through the standard level content of the topic of gas exchange as part of the IB biology curriculum. As organisms become larger, their surface area to volume ratio decreases, which means that the distance between the center of that organism and the surface area increases, which means that the diffusion length and the diffusion distance also increases. And this means that it takes longer for nutrients that has been diffused through that surface. It would take longer for it to reach that center, which is obviously a problem. To combat this, organisms have adapted to have systems within themselves for more effective nutrient uptake, and one of these examples is a respiratory system in humans for gas exchange. What happens is obviously oxygen and carbon dioxide flow in and out of the lungs, and then the gas exchange happens in the alveoli. However, for this to happen, you need the pressure within the lungs to change. And this is because gas likes to travel from an area of high pressure and to low pressure. And that is exactly what happens within your thorax, and your thorax is essentially the area between your neck and your abdomen. What happens within your thorax is that two pairs of antagonistic muscles, which are essentially just muscles that work in opposing ways. So, for example, if one contracts, the other relaxes. So, two pairs of antagonistic muscles work within your thorax for you to be able to inhale and exhale. And those two pairs are the internal intercostal muscle and the external intercostal muscle. So that's one pair. And then the other one is the diaphragm, and the other is the abdominal muscles. Don't know how to spell. But essentially, those work together for you to be able to inhale and exhale. So, what happens when you inhale? When you inhale, your internal intercostal muscles relax. Relax. Your external ones contract. Your diaphragm contracts. And your abdominal muscles relax. And what happens when your external intercostal muscles contract is that it causes your rib cage to move outward and also upward. When your diaphragm contracts, it causes it to move downward. And this all increases the volume of the thorax, which again decreases the pressure within your thorax. And because the pressure is now lower than in the atmosphere, that means that the gases are able to flow into your lungs. Now the opposite happens when you exhale. Your internal intercostal muscles contract. The external ones relax. The diaphragm relaxes, and your abdominal muscles contract. And again, now because your external intercostal muscles relax, your rib cage moves inward and downward. So all of these muscles working together, when your diaphragm relaxes, it moves again upward. And your internal intercostal muscles contracting make it so that the lungs are or your thorax is compressed. So again, all of this decreases the volume in the thorax and it increases the pressure. Now, because you have a higher pressure now than in the atmosphere, all the gases are going to be moving out of the lungs. So that's how you're able to inhale and exhale with those muscles. Now, within your lungs, you've got the alveoli, which are the site of gas exchange. And the alveoli themselves are adapted to their function. So these adaptations they have a large surface area to volume ratio. They are permeable. because obviously you want gases to be able to diffuse from the alveoli to the capillaries and vice versa. They have thin walls because it is easier to diffuse through thin walls than it is through thicker walls. They are moist because gases diffuse in a solution, and they also have a diffusion gradient, or a mechanism for a diffusion gradient. So what I mean by that is that when you inhale, your alveoli are filled with oxygen. So there would be a lot of oxygen in your alveoli when you breathe in. And this means that the alveoli have a higher concentration than the capillaries do. Now, because diffusion is the movement from an area of high to low concentration, this means that diffusion will happen from the alveoli into the capillaries. And the opposite is true when you exhale. So when you exhale, all of this CO2 is brought out, which means that the capillaries are now the site of high CO2 concentration, which means that they will diffuse from the capillaries into the alveoli. So that's what I mean by a mechanism for diffusion gradient. Now there are two more adaptations we need to know for the alveoli, and those are the cells that are found within the alveoli, type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes. Type 1 pneumocytes are these really thin cells, and they cover around 95% of the alveoli's surface area, and they're the place of gas exchange, hence why they are so thin. Now type 2 pneumocytes are different. They cover again only around 5% of the surface area, and they secrete pulmonary surfactant. And this surfactant decreases surface tension, which is really important because it prevents the alveoli from collapsing in on itself, which would be very dangerous for us because we need to intake oxygen to survive, and we need gas exchange to be able to happen. Now we can move on to the plants of gas exchange, or the plant area. And the first thing we're going to do is nothing to do with gas exchange, but it is to memorize what the cross-section of a dicotyledonous leaf looks like. And the way I memorize how it's drawn is how I memorize everything that we need to learn how to draw, and that's by cutting it up into 3 sections. So the first thing I do is I do the outermost layers, and this are called the upper and the lower epidermis. Then you've also got the waxy cuticle on both the upper and the lower epidermis. And on top of these, you've also got guard cells and the stomata. Then I draw the layer that's on top, which is this layer called the palisade layer, made up of palisade cells. And then this middle circle, which is the xylem and the phloem. So this top one would be the xylem, this bottom one would be the phloem. And then the final step, which is adding the spongy mesophyll, which is just a bunch of chain of circles when you draw them, so it's not that difficult, I feel like, once you split it up into 3 different mini tasks rather than having to draw this all at once. Now, palisade cells are where most of photosynthesis happens within this leaf, and so it's important that gas exchange does happen within this leaf, and it does so through the stomata. So the stomata is just an opening, or it's a pore within the leaf. And so what happens is that carbon dioxide will diffuse into the cell until it reaches the palisade layer, and then it will undergo photosynthesis, and then oxygen will be released and will diffuse out of the cell also through the stomata. Now, another thing that can diffuse out of the stomata is water vapor, and that's called transpiration. So transpiration is the loss of water vapor from the leaves of plant through the stomata. And this causes tension, and this tension causes water to flow upward the leaf from the roots through the stem up to the leaf. So transpiration, even though it is the loss of water or the loss of water vapor, also causes more water to be able to move up the plant. And there are 4 different factors of transpiration that we need to learn. And those are temperature, wind intensity, light intensity, and humidity. So let's start with temperature. As temperature increases, so does the rate of transpiration, because the higher the temperature, the more water will evaporate. And again, since transpiration is the loss of water vapor, this means that there will be more water vapor and therefore more water will be lost. Then wind intensity, as it increases, so does the rate of transpiration. And this is because wind will remove water vapor from the leaf and from the top of the leaf and from the surrounding area, so in the atmosphere. And it will therefore make the water concentration of the air around the leaf lower. And because of osmosis, water will diffuse out of the leaf. Then you've got light intensity. And light intensity is because as it increases, so does the rate of transpiration. And this is because with more light, there will be more photosynthesis. And because with more photosynthesis, obviously you want more carbon dioxide. As seen here, the stomata will open more. So more stomata will open, and it will open for longer and stuff like that, because it needs that gas exchange to happen for more photosynthesis. But the opening of the stomata will also cause for more water vapor to leave from the leaf. And then humidity. Humidity is the opposite of wind intensity. As there's an increase in humidity, there's a decrease in the rate of transpiration. And this is because humidity just means there's more water in the air. And that means that there's going to be a higher concentration of water in the surrounding air of the leaf. And that will mean that less vapor will diffuse out of the leaf. Yeah, that's all for the standard level content for gas exchange. I hope this was useful to you. And as always, I will leave the whiteboard in the description. Hey guys, so today I will be going through the higher level content of the topic of gas exchange as part of the IB biology curriculum. So before I start, I want to explain what partial pressure is. And essentially, partial pressure is the pressure exerted by one gas in a mixture of gases. So for example, you have got the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is made up of different gases, but it is mainly nitrogen. There is an abundance of nitrogen in the air, in the atmosphere. And that means that nitrogen has a high partial pressure. So nitrogen has a high partial pressure compared to oxygen, which is only around 20% or 21% of the atmosphere, would have in comparison a low partial pressure. And that is how partial pressure is written, with a little p in front of the gas. So yeah, that's partial pressure. So now we can move on to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a globular protein, and it is made up of 4 polypeptide chains. And in each polypeptide chain, you have 1 heme group. And this heme group is essentially just an iron molecule. And this iron molecule is what the oxygen binds onto. So without this heme group, you wouldn't be able to have oxygen binded onto it. And because there are 4 polypeptide chains in 1 hemoglobin molecule, you will get 4 oxygens binded onto it. Now, as you can tell from this diagram, as more oxygens bind onto this hemoglobin, the conformation, aka the shape of the hemoglobin, changes. And this is called cooperative, oh my god, my handwriting, binding. And essentially what this means is that in areas of low partial pressure of oxygen, which again just means that there is less oxygen in that specific mixture of gases, there is also a lower affinity for oxygen, which means that the oxygen, or the hemoglobin I suppose, will actually unload the oxygen, and oxygen finds it much harder to bind onto that hemoglobin. However, in areas of high partial pressure of oxygen, you also get a high affinity of oxygen of that hemoglobin. Now we can see all this in a graph. So this graph is called an oxygen dissociation curve. And this curve is sigmoidal, which essentially means that it is an S-shaped curve. And what we can see from this graph is how much, what the percent of the saturation of oxygen based on the partial pressure of oxygen within the bloodstream. What else we can tell from this graph is what areas the blood is possibly going to. So what I mean by that is, let's just cut this graph up into 3 different sections, and I'll use these lines as a guide. This area right here could be an area of exercise muscles. So this could be an area of exercise muscles. And we can know this because of respiration. There's going to be less oxygen available in these tissues because of that respiration. Now we want the blood to have a lower affinity of oxygen in these areas because we don't want the oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin, but we want it to diffuse into the muscle tissues because obviously those muscles need it for respiration. On the other side, we could have this area could be the area of the lungs. Now, we want the blood to have a high affinity for oxygen in this area because we don't want the oxygen to stay in the alveoli. We want it to diffuse into the blood. And for that to happen, we need this lung area, to have a high partial pressure of oxygen because, again, that increases the affinity of hemoglobin. And then in the middle part over here, we can have the resting muscles. So muscles that are currently not working. And this is because obviously they still need some oxygen to survive, but they don't need as much as exercise muscles, and they definitely don't have as much oxygen as the lungs have. So what else you can see from this graph is the difference between fetal and adult hemoglobin. As we can see from the key, this blue line is the fetal hemoglobin, and this is shifted to the left. And this is because fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen. Why is that? This is because when the blood of the pregnant person has reached the placenta, it already has a low partial pressure of oxygen. So for the fetus to be able to get as much oxygen as it needs, the hemoglobin will naturally also have to have an increased affinity for oxygen. Now, once the baby is born, the fetal hemoglobin will slowly start being replaced by adult hemoglobin, and it will take around 6 months for it to be completely replaced. Now, there's one last factor that affects hemoglobin's affinity, and that is carbon dioxide. So, what carbon dioxide does to the blood, as is shown here, it decreases the pH in the blood, so it makes it more acidic. And as the pH of the blood decreases, capital H, the affinity of oxygen also decreases. And then the opposite is true. So if the pH increases, the affinity of oxygen also increases. Now let's imagine we've got these different parts of the graph again, where we've got the exercise muscles, we've got the lungs. The carbon dioxide affecting the affinity of blood makes sense because in the exercise muscles, we've got a high concentration of carbon dioxide because, again, respiration is happening and that releases a lot of carbon dioxide as a product. That means that we also want a high affinity of, or a high concentration of oxygen so it can respire. That means that we want the affinity of the hemoglobin to decrease, because a decrease in affinity means that there is going to be more unloading of oxygen from that hemoglobin and more diffusion into the muscle tissues. Now, the opposite is true for the lungs. In the lungs, we have a low concentration of carbon dioxide, and we want it to be like that because we don't want the oxygen to stay in the lungs. We want it to diffuse into the blood. We want the affinity of the hemoglobin to be increased. So this overall makes sense. And this is called the Bohr's effect. So the carbon dioxide changing the affinity of the blood is called the Bohr's effect. So that is all for the higher level content. And to me, it's quite interesting, even though it's not a lot we have to learn. And as always, I will leave the whiteboard in the description so you have a poster version of this. I hope this helped a little bit. Goodbye.